My name is Lynn Swan. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the resort, and I am thrilled beyond belief to introduce our fireside chat for today, Mr. Stephen Grant. After a lengthy diplomatic career, Mr. Grant shifted gears to a writing life, and he now serves as Senior Fellow at the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training in Arlington, Virginia, where he helps retired diplomats prepare their manuscripts for publication. On the Ides of March 2014, Johns Hopkins University Press released Mr. Grant's 5th book, Collecting Shakespeare, The Story of Henry and Emily Folger. In addition to being here to mark our resort's 250th anniversary, we're also marking the 400th anniversary of the Bard's death. So, without further ado, I give you Mr. Grant.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm delighted to be here. The first thing I want to do is introduce my partner, Abigail Weavenson. And
hello, everybody.
And point out what she is wearing on her neck, because this is a piece of Duchesse Belgian lace that belonged to Emily Jordan Folger, who is pictured on the cover.
With more lace. All right, so what you will have to do, if you don't mind getting close to me at some point, you have to see what's here, because on the front are voluptuous ladies, and on the back are cupids. So at some point you have to just see these, because I was just astounded, because at first I thought they were her wedding dress, and I thought, voluptuous ladies in her wedding dress? Okay, but anyway, you'll have a look.
I have divided my presentation into 2 parts. The first part is Shakespeare collectors. The second part is Homestead guests. As Lynn mentioned, both aspects of the Folgers' lives are marked by significant anniversaries this year. When I arrived yesterday at the Homestead, my first visit, I hadn't been here 8 hours before a waiter came to our table. His name was Omar. He's from Jamaica. And he said, "Mr. Grant, I hear you're a writer. What inspires you to write?" This is a very special place, if you haven't been here that long, when people get into a deep literary discussion with you. And we evoked a couple of things. One was the passion that one has for one's subject, and the other is the curiosity that drives one to learn about their subject. A biographer captures or resurrects a life. I have written a dual biography, which means a biography of 2 people. It was a quiet couple that lived in Brooklyn during the Gilded Age. They were born in the 1850s and died in the 1930s. They chose 2 vacation spots. One was Glen Cove, Long Island, and they lived in a modest home right opposite the railroad station and the Nassau Country Club, and that's where Henry played most of his golf. But they also adopted the Homestead as a vacation spot, where they came for 16 years, from 1914 to 1929. Last night, Abigail and I slept in the Folger room, which they had occupied, which at the time was numbered 527 and 529, and under the renumbered policy, it's 1196, and probably the other one was 1194, is my guess, because there's an adjoining door there.
Did you wake up with Folgers in your cup?
That's a very astute comment. So I want to start at the beginning. We will talk about the education, the vocation, and the avocation of Henry and Emily Folger. This is an early photo of Henry Folger. Look how serious he is. And look what he is holding in his hand. It's a book. It's a small book. It's not a rattle. It's a book. And the spine is facing up. This is the first of 92,000 books that Henry Folger will acquire in his lifetime. Now I'd like to introduce you to Henry's wife-to-be, who is very taken aback about this idea of collecting 92,000 books. Emily is saying, what? Henry dear, we are going to collect 92,000 books? How are we going to do that? Well, the years march on, don't they? And Emily is now in her senior year at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Vassar College started by the beer brewer Matthew Vassar, who was convinced that women were the intellectual equals of men. Why shouldn't they have their own college? And in 1865 started Vassar, which is now co-ed, but for many years was only for women. And Emily graduated in the class of 1879. She was elected president of her class for life. There were only 15 other members of the class. She came back faithfully to reunions. She gave money to the alumni fund. She loved Vassar. She even returned to Vassar to get a master's degree in 1896 in Shakespeare Studies, a year when only 250 women in the country got a master's degree. Henry went to Amherst College. He is standing at the top, in the middle. Henry Folger. You notice that he's clean shaven, whereas if you look on the cover, he's sprouted a thicket of a beard. Henry Folger, with all of these young men, went to prep school in Brooklyn at Adelphi Academy. On Henry's left is a man with a different shaped hat. They all have hats and canes, you can note. On Henry's left is Charles M. Pratt, Charles Millard Pratt. Henry and Charlie were roommates for 4 years in the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity at Amherst. Charles M. Pratt's father, Charles Pratt, founded Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and I can see many people in the audience nodded. 1 week after Henry and Charlie graduated from Amherst, they went to work for Charlie's father, who, in addition to being a leader in education, was also the largest oil refiner in the country in 1869. And a decade later, Henry and Emily went to work for Charles Pratt Sr., who had been bought out by John D. Rockefeller in a secret deal. Here are the two couples. So you have the two Amherst men and the two Vassar ladies. Henry is on the right, and you can tell he's sprouted a mustache. Emily is in the dark dress with her elbow in the lap of Mrs. Charles Pratt, who was Mary Seymour Morris of New Jersey, and Charles Pratt is standing. So these two couples were very close to each other for their whole lives. They were in, the men were in Brooklyn together, and then as couples, they lived in Brooklyn. They also had their summer homes in Glen Cove, and they had a deep friendship to the extent that when Henry Folger was buying books on Shakespeare, he would go out of his way to look for books on Lepidoptera, because that was the passion of Charlie Pratt and his wife Mary. And Henry ended up buying 1,400 books on butterflies that he would give to the Pratts for birthdays and Christmas. Just imagine this phalanx of serious people in dark coats walking toward you. If any of you have the book America by Alistair Cook, this photo is in there. In order to get it for my book, it's one of the 34 images that are in my book. I had to pay a hefty sum to Brown Brothers that hold the copyright. So in the middle, the glum face of John D. Rockefeller Sr., heavy overcoat, leather gloves. Behind him is two young, overworked attorneys that were certainly working hard the night before to prepare for the antitrust hearings that took place in the New York Custom House. But when John D. Rockefeller and others were grilled for their monopolistic practices, compare their sullen countenances with the elated messenger boys on the right who have the opportunity to get out of 26 Broadway, which was referred to as the Tower of Secrecy. And then on your left, you find a man who's not wearing an overcoat, his jacket isn't unbuttoned, he doesn't look glum, he doesn't look elated, he's somewhere in between. I say he has sort of a debonair air about him. That is Henry Folger. Henry Folger is John D. Rockefeller's right-hand man, literally and figuratively. John D. Rockefeller did not have a college education. When people such as Charlie Pratt and Henry Folger came to work for his company, he was delighted because they had intellectual prowess that others didn't have. Henry had, in addition to his Amherst education, a law degree from Columbia. And although he didn't work in the Standard Oil legal department, John D. knew that he could rely on Henry for very good legal advice that might have been a little bit different from that he would get from the legal department. I'm showing you a check, Columbia Trust Company. The date is January 29th, 1918. The amount is $53,000, made out to John D. Rockefeller, signed H.C. Folger. Now, why would anyone write a check to the wealthiest man in the world? Well, you have to think of what Henry Folger was doing in addition to his day job at Standard Oil. He was putting together with his wife Emily what became the largest collection of Shakespeare in the world. And he didn't have time to go to bookstores, so he would rely on commission agents to represent him at auctions, mainly in London, but also in New York. And when you bid on an item, you don't know whether you're going to get it. And when you do win it, then you have to pay up. So even though Henry, who became president of Standard Oil of New York, that later became Mobil Oil Corporation, was a wealthy man, he lived a life of short-term debt. He was always rearranging his finances so that he could pay for these treasures, which are in the Folger Shakespeare Library on Capitol Hill. $53,000 in 1918, or about $885,000 today. Rockefeller would charge the usual the going rate, which is generally 6% back then. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the high brow of William Shakespeare. And you're aware that 2016 is celebrating the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. This is the title page from a book called the First Folio. Folio really is a printer's term, which has to do with the size of the paper, and it's about the size of an encyclopedia. So you can think of it as 10 inches by 13 inches. This was an engraving which came out during Shakespeare's lifetime, so we think it is fairly accurate. The First Folio, however, came out after Shakespeare died. He died in 1616, and this book came out in 1623. And it's a compilation of 36 Shakespeare plays. If you open a First Folio, this is what it looks like. So you have double columns, can you see that? It's about 900 pages. And because of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, the Folger Shakespeare Library, that possesses 82 different copies of the First Folio that came out in 1623, decided to send a copy to all 50 states and Washington, D.C., as well as Puerto Rico, to be on exhibit for 4 or 5 weeks. And institutions such as libraries, theaters, historical societies, universities, colleges competed to see who would get this magnificent, irreplaceable object to be on display. For Virginia, it was University of Virginia at Charlottesville. And it'll be on display in October. So if you're interested in seeing one of these 1623 First Folios that does not travel very often, you can Google University, UVA, for the October dates. In preparation for writing this book, I visited 35 archives, but by far the most important one was the Folger Shakespeare Library underground vault itself. And on the right is my laptop, which I have right here. And I showed you this picture so you could get an idea of the relative size of a First Folio. The First Folio that you see there is a leather-bound copy. When the First Folio came out in 1623, they were uncut pages and it was not bound. So as different owners bought the folio, they bound it according to their tastes. Just as Henry Folger saved canceled checks, and you've seen one of them, he also saved all of the mailing labels. Can you imagine 92,000 books, mailing labels? And they didn't collect only books. They collected 250,000 playbills, 60,000 engravings, 204 oil paintings. So this says at the top, old books, duty-free, printed over 20 years ago. Now that's a pretty good deal. You bring in a First Folio from 1623, you don't pay any duty because it's over 20 years old. This is Emily Folger. You saw Emily as a toddler in her calico dress, somewhat taken aback. Now she's completely taken into stride her role of being an educated woman and working on the collection of Shakespeare. Her parents never went to college. Henry's parents never went to college. Emily, as I mentioned, had not only a bachelor's but a master's degree. Here she is painted in her Vassar pink hood. In her hand she's holding a Shakespeare fan with a scene from Henry V. Henry is sitting in his purple Amherst hood, and in his hand, he has a book. It's not the First Folio, which would have looked very big compared to his hands, perhaps. It is a thick volume of 10 quartos. If you have a page of a folio and fold it in half, it becomes a quarto. And a quarto is the size of the plays that came out. So he is holding a book that he paid something like $50,000 for. He considers it one of the most valuable books in the world. The First Folio, he collected 82 of them. But this is the only book that's known to exist, so it's completely unique. And when he went to sit for his painting in New York City, he wrapped up this invaluable volume in a newspaper and carried it on the subway. This is the Folger Shakespeare Library, 2 blocks from the US Capitol on East Capitol Street. It's right across the street from the Library of Congress, for those that have been there. It's catty-cornered from the Supreme Court. And this was the day of the inauguration. Shakespeare's birthday, April 23rd, 1932. Those are the motorcycles of the Secret Service. President Herbert Hoover and his wife, Lou. And as we know, Hoover was also a guest at the Homestead. And I've learned since I've been here that Hoover was a guest at the Homestead in 1929 and 1932. In 1929, the Folgers were guests at the Homestead at 3 different occasions. We don't yet know whether they met, but they might have. But by the time that the library was dedicated, Henry Folger had died. He died of a pulmonary aneurysm. So he never saw all his books together. He never saw one stone of the Folger Library. His wife Emily lived 6 years longer and was the one who not only saw to the opening of the library on time, making a lot of decisions about hiring of staff and purchase of books and materials. This is the first aerial photo of the Folger Library, which you see in the upper left. Across the street is the Library of Congress. And if you see the construction site, what is there today?
Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. This is a very poignant picture because Henry has died. And the portrait of Henry that you saw in color is taken in a black and white photograph in 1932. Emily has gone to Amherst College to receive an honorary doctorate. Henry received an honorary doctorate in 1914. So Henry and Emily, whose parents hadn't been to college, both of them had a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and an honorary doctorate. The Folgers had no children. They left behind no descendants, but they did leave behind the greatest Shakespeare collection in the world. My publisher, Johns Hopkins Press, asked me for an author headshot for the jacket, and I thought about that. And then I said, no, I have something better than a headshot. I'm going to send you a wall shot. Because look at the company that I'm in. I'm standing between my 2 subjects. I'm standing underneath Will Shakespeare. And in Will's right hand is a quill. Will with his quill. So I look at this as Henry and Emily loved each other They both loved Shakespeare, and this is the greatest ménage à trois in literary history. Now for part two, I'm going to have to ask Emily to help me, and I will ask the audience to fasten their seat belts for some time travel.
There you go. There you go. There you go. And you need that. Go out in front so that people can see you.
That looks like the Homestead.
Yes!
It does.
Let's put the putter in front. I think it's just so bad. Never had a schenectady putter before. Oops, oops, oops. Oh my God, I'm going to be in the doghouse. There we go.
This is what, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is what the Homestead looked like in 1914. The first year I took Emily there for our vacation. We took the train from New York City. You probably know by now that I saved everything my whole life. Theater tickets, canceled checks, mailing labels, you name it. I also saved my invoices. You, guests at the 250th anniversary of the Homestead. I'll show you some of those invoices a bit later. You might be envious. But first, let's peek at the message on the other side of the postcard. Dear Father, Hot Springs is a beautiful town, but it takes a lot of cash to stay any length of time. Signed, Otto. How true. The grand lobby of the Homestead. One of my favorite haunts. You felt so very small there. This postcard was written in German script. Clara is writing her brother, Alfred. Lieber Bruder, bei all den guten Zeiten wird es einem doch langweilig. Am Nachmittag erlaube ich mir einen kleinen Vergnügensgang. Which means, dear brother, even with all the good activities, it gets boring sometimes. This afternoon, I'm granting myself a little walk for my amusement. Die Luft ist hier kraftvoll. Wenn auch die Wege noch zu lehmig sind, macht es einem doch Vergnügen. The air here is quite bracing, and even though the paths are still muddy, it's fun. The Homestead was an international destination, you see. Emily prepared this translation for me. Her German was better than mine. The tower was built in the spring of 1929. The message on the other side was more positive. Quel beau coin, je ne crois guère qu'il y a un pays plus joli. L'air est délicieux, seulement un peu de moustique. What a beautiful place. I don't think I've visited a better country. The air is delicious, but there are some mosquitoes. So another foreign guest, you see. My French was so-so, but Emily's was better. The Bathhouse, built in 1892, is where you'd find my wife. Doctor's orders. She loved to take the waters. It was a long walk to the bathhouse from our lodgings along a serpentine corridor. To complete the ritual with grace and dignity, ladies adopted the habit of dressing up. Attire customarily consisted of trimmed chiffons and silks and included elaborate embroidery. My Emily's bath costume was unique. The purple velvet robe Julia Marlowe wore when she played Portia from The Merchant of Venice. I purchased the item from the actress for our Shakespeare collection. Emily is modeling the robe with the lace collar. Oh, how she loved lace. When we were married, she wore a satin and lace gown. This is our first Homestead invoice from 1914. Daily rate, $16. We had extra charges for baths, drugs, livery, and guest dinners. An invoice from 1917. Daily rate, $17. Extra charges for baths, golf, livery, baggage, and newsstand. We had to keep up with the news, especially the auction sales in London. This is our last Homestead invoice from 1929. Daily rate, $40. Extra charges for golf and newsstand. In all, we spent 20 marvelous months at the Homestead every year for 16 years, with an average of stays lasting 5 weeks. Now in 1929, the last year that the Folgers went to the Homestead, they went 3 times. It's the only year they went for 3 times. The reason may be that in 1928, Henry retired after 29 years at the Standard Oil Company. He retired so that he could devote himself to the design of a memorial to house his collection of Shakespeare. His last trip was in August of 1929. The end of October 1929, the Great Crash. So 1929 is the year that the tower at the Homestead was built, the year that the Empire State Building was built, and the year that Henry Folger may have realized that all of his Standard Oil dividends, salary, stock was worth about half what he thought it was. Our hotel suite was always well stocked with hotel stationery. I found its letterhead very distinguished. I booked through Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City. I wrote the date here, February 11th, 1918. Although I used my Standard Oil personal secretary in New York for my correspondence, at the Homestead I hand wrote my own letters. Let's see what this one was about. Dear Mr. McCreary, he was my real estate agent. Inquire very cautiously about the 4 properties on Capitol Hill that I have marked on the accompanying diagram. Of course, we needed a home for our Shakespeare collection. It took us 9 years to buy up the 14 row houses that formed Grant's Row on East Capitol. I didn't want anyone to know I was the one purchasing the lots, for I was sure that the prices for antiquarian Shakespeare editions would soar. I put them all in Emily's name. Oh, another check of mine. This one was signed on July 22nd, 1919, and made out to the Rosenbach Company in Philadelphia for $100,000, which is $1.5 million today. I wrote this check from the Homestead. We came down here with our abbreviated cart catalog so we wouldn't miss any of the great auctions. Of course, I was buying more Shakespeare. This volume was so special, it was unique. It was the first published collected works of Shakespeare in 1619 called the Pay Via Quartos, which I referred to earlier. Edward Gwynne was the first owner. These are bound quartos attributed to Shakespeare. His name is printed in gilded letters on the cover, as though it were freshly printed. This book is on display this month at the Folger Shakespeare Library, as a matter of fact. My biographer, Stephen Grant, found out how much I actually paid for it and shared my secret in his biography, Collecting Shakespeare. But I don't hold it against him. After all, I had to wait 84 years for my biography to appear. And I have a soft place in my heart for him on another account. We share an alma mater. He graduated from Amherst College 84 years after I did. The trustees of Amherst administer the Folger Shakespeare Library today, a desire I expressed in my will.
Oh my.
It's right here.
Emily, where's my club?
Your club's right here. That's pretty good, sweetie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that it?
We get the
Is that about it?
picture.
I was hoping to see myself in golf attire with my favorite club, the Schenectady putter. With this putter and a good partner, I won a senior Homestead golf tournament in 1926 and 1928. At 5'4" and weighing 120 pounds, I was not powerful on the fairway, but I had the reputation of being deadly on the green, and that's where you make most of your shots. Mind you, I was not the only golfer in the news because of this putter. With me in this drawing from the press is Lieutenant Colonel W.B. Dupre from England. Perfectly legal when I use it in competition. I think it was Bobby Jones that later had it outlawed. These will be the last two illustrations this afternoon, as my biographer reminds me that it is time for Q&A and then for him to sign a few books. If you go across the corridor from the Tower Suite where we are now to the Washington Library, you will see a picture of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And here is the caption. John D. Rockefeller Jr. exhibits his skill in handling the reins of a favorite team. He and his father were frequent visitors to the homestead. John D. Rockefeller Sr., it is said, would toss dimes in the creek in back of the first tee of the homestead course prior to his game of golf for the amusement of the caddies between rounds. He reportedly gave away $35,000 that way. Every morning his valet would stuff John D.'s pockets with dimes. I received a few dimes from John D. Rockefeller every time we played together and I sunk a 15-foot putt. My nephew confirmed this in an interview with the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library, O.B. Hardison. The 1920 Mercury dimes collected in my top bureau drawer until after I was gone, and Emily had the brilliant idea to turn them into a silver watch band that embellished her handsome wrist. It is a fitting image to end on, as it links me to my wife and to my boss, the two most important people in my life.
Poor ear. There you have your ear back.
Now you may unfasten your seatbelts. The time travel is over. And I'd be happy to entertain comments, questions. We have the historian of the Homestead in the hall. We have one of the recently retired golf pros at the Homestead in the hall, but there are others who would perhaps also like to have a word. And then later, I will go to the signing table if you'd like to buy a book that I'd be very happy to inscribe to you. Yes?
Did Mr. Folger ever meet, in his travels, or his wife ever meet any people from the Booth family of actors?
Yes, I'm sure they did. They certainly corresponded with Edwin Booth.
Okay.
And they saved a lot of the Edwin Booth artifacts, prompt books, and they had photographs of Booth. I don't remember exactly when they met, but my guess is they did.
What was your process of finding a publisher?
Process of finding a publisher, not easy. Claude Marx is a publisher. Is a biographer. He and I belong to the same biography group. And one of the things we discuss in this group is how to find a publisher. So it was in this Washington biography group that I talked to someone who said, you really should find an agent and not try on your own to identify a publisher, because publishers prefer to deal with agents and not directly with an author. So then I had to find out, how do I get an agent? Well, there are a number of author groups that invite agents to their annual meetings or quarterly meetings, and you can find out the biographies of these agents. So I found one who had a PhD in UCLA in English history. And I said, well, this is probably someone who recognizes Shakespeare. This is a person who had worked for a publishing company in California, and we got in touch with each other, and we're still in touch today. So she became my agent. And that's how I found a publisher, through my agent. And the publisher was Johns Hopkins Press. It's the oldest academic press in the country, founded in 1878. I live in Arlington, Virginia. They're in Baltimore. It's an hour away. I get in the train, I go there. I meet with a marketing director, with a sales director. They come to see me. So it's been an easy relationship with the publisher, and also a very happy relationship with my agent. Yes?
I've got a very technical golf question for the historian and the pro. Steve said that Mr. Folger came here between 1914 and 1929, and that in 26 and 28 he won a senior tournament here. I guess my question is, have you any idea, or did they have handicap indexes back then, and do you have any idea what his index was if he was winning these tournaments on a net basis or a gross basis?
I have no idea what his handicap would have been, but they cheat all the time anyway. No, that was just a few years after the Cascades opened those, so I'm sure they played those tournaments on the Cascades course. It opened in '23. This one opened in 1892, so he played this course to start with. He probably finished up on the Cascade course, his tournaments. Senior tournaments, I would say it was a better ball, because he said he had a good partner, so it's bound to have been a better ball too. And
I've studied most of the tournaments that we've had. The Fay Eagles, who shot regularly in the 80s, and most golfers back then who shot below 100 were considered good golfers. you shot in the 80s or middle 80s, you were exceptional. Most people don't know that bogey was the original par. It started out in Scotland. And so we've come all that way to down now all we want to do is shoot birdies. But it hasn't always been that way. You know, the score wasn't always that important. A lot of us played match play. So the total score was never that important. But it became that way a little bit later on. I would guess, though, probably in the mid-80s, 90s, somewhere in that area.
I would say they were playing without handicap.
Yeah.
I would say they were playing straight up.
So it's more an English type of match play.
Correct.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question. From the, I'll use your term sprouted, from the time that the idea of this book sprouted in your head till completion to see it actually in hand, how long was that?
7 years.
Wow. That's a good portion.
This is my second biography. The first biography also took 7 years. But what was different about it was the amount of material that I had to go through. Librarians in particular measure the material in linear feet. All right? So if you have on a shelf linear feet. My first biography was about a sea captain from New London, Connecticut, who became the first American consul in French West Africa. And I found 1 linear foot of information on him, having to do with ship logs, a daily diary that he kept from age 19 to age 83, his family correspondence. He wrote a book, but it didn't amount to more than a foot. When I looked into the Henry Folger and Emily Folger project, I took a tape measure into the vault. And with Betsy Walsh, the head of Reader Services, we measured every single archival angle to find out what I was getting into. And I came up with 424 linear feet.
Wow.
That is a football field and a quarter.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And I did this not right away, so I had already committed myself until I found out what I was in for. But let me say my last comment on that was that out of the 424 linear feet, 258 linear feet were book auction catalogs. So I didn't look at all those so much, but I'm talking only about the personal papers of the Folger. I'm not talking about the books and so forth. So the way that the teamwork took place was that Emily was the one that went through the catalogs because she had time during the day when Henry was at his day job. And she would go through these 258 linear feet of catalogs, find an item that she thought they needed in their collection, put a question mark after it in pencil, turn the corner over, and then when Henry came home, they went through every single item that Emily thought they should have. So she's really the one who defined the nature of the collection. She's also the one who put together the card catalog. And as you can imagine, she developed writer's cramp.
Sweetie, tell the connection between Folger Coffee, since you mentioned
Yes,
Folger
you
Coffee.
did.
Yes.
The Folgers have lived on Nantucket Island since the 1630s. They came over from East Anglia in the Great Puritan Migration. They first settled around Dedham in Massachusetts and Watertown and Martha's Vineyard. Peter Folger, who was a surveyor from Martha's Vineyard, surveyed Nantucket. And he helped negotiate the purchase of Nantucket for some of the first families that had come from England, from the Indians. And Nantucket was purchased for 30 pounds and 2 beaver hats. So among the Folgers that lived on Nantucket Island were whalers. Nantucket was the largest whaling capital up until about 1840. Henry's uncle James Folger was not able to be in the whaling industry relations either as a maker of harpoons or as a sea captain because the industry had plummeted. So he went to the West Coast with the gold rush. He was looking for gold. He found some gold dust, but not very much. But what he did find out was that the quality of coffee that people were drinking in San Francisco was insipid. He said, I can do better than that. So in 1851, he and a partner founded Folger Coffee. So it's the same family. It's Henry's uncle. I have no proof that they ever met, but the uncle was born in Nantucket. This Henry's father was born in Nantucket. So it's the same family.
Well, that was my other question too, because you mentioned that they had no children. He and
Yes.
Emily had no children.
Right.
So I wondered about the heritage there, because it's an interesting little tidbit that I believe one of the heirs to the Folger fortune was killed by one of the Manson. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So the heir to the Folger Coffee fortune was Abigail Folger, who was killed on August 9th, 1969 in the Charles Manson slayings.
She was on the, was it the Roman Polanski?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Sharon Tate.
Yes, I wondered what the connection was.
Yeah, that's
them.
right. And so the next heir was Abigail's younger brother, another Peter Folger,
Oh, is that?
whom I'm in contact with. He recently retired in San Francisco as an attorney. I've inscribed my book to him and members of his family. We haven't been able to meet yet, but we've talked on the phone, and we are in touch. And Abigail and I were in Santa Fe last month. When this First Folio is going to be exhibited, we've already gone to the New Mexico Museum of Art, and I gave a talk there at the New Mexico Museum of Art in the St. Francis Auditorium. And at one point in the question period, the name Folger came up, and I said, do we have a Folger in the house? And somebody raised his hand. He said, yes.
Oh, my.
I'm related to one of the families living in Nantucket today.
That's a small world.
Another question.
What's the chance of you or someone from the Folger bringing some of Shakespeare here for a reading or even an acting out sometime in the future? Maybe October 2016?
Well, I can certainly take that message back. And I think Lynn Swan would be a good person to coordinate with. As you can imagine, 2016 is a very full year, not only for the Folger Library in Washington, sending a First Folio with all of the security that is necessary. In England, they're having a lot of celebrations. The Globe Theatre is taking the play Hamlet to every single country in the world. So maybe if you would settle for 2017, something could be worked out. But since you and Shakespeare deal in these large figure anniversaries of 250 and 400, I would hope that something could be worked out, and I appreciate that interest. Thank you very much for coming. The Folger Shakespeare Library Education Office has found that one of the most effective ways to interest youngsters in Shakespeare is to have them learn insults from the bard's plays and hurl them at one another. Johns Hopkins University Press hired a freelance designer who devised a superlative book cover showing Henry and Emily Folger dwarfed by a book. In fact, an 1875 binding of a First Folio with elaborate gold and red tooling. I am seated in the main dining room contemplating the thought. Henry and Emily Folger sat here and enjoyed homestead hospitality more than a century ago. Abigail Webenson, to whom Collecting Shakespeare is dedicated, modeled a blouse made from Belgian Duchesse lace that Emily Folger wore. The piece was generously loaned by a grandniece with the namesake Emily. From 1917 to 1929, the Folgers stayed in this homestead room for an average of 5 weeks each year. The resort kindly invited me to sleep in the Folger room for the weekend in 2016, a rare privilege for a biographer. I returned home from the homestead with a souvenir from the gift shop. I'm posing next to a signed portrait of Henry Folger, graciously given to me by the Folger family.